everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, City of Trees. My name is Leanne and I'm the Environmental Coordinator at Willoughby City Council. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we are today, we are all on the lands of Aboriginal traditional owners. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging, and thank them for sharing with us their knowledge on how to care for this country. Tonight's webinar is part of Council's Canopy of Life Tree Festival 2024, a celebration of the trees in our local urban environment. During this festival period, we have unique workshops, talks, walks and activities that are available for the community to join. We hope that through these activities, our residents have a greater understanding and appreciation of the immense benefits that trees provide on both private and public land. Which brings us to this session called City of Trees with our guest speaker, Paul Knox. Paul, we can see you soon. There you go. Paul has worked in the horticultural industry for over 50 years with formal qualifications in horticulture and landscape architecture. He forged a successful career as a landscape designer for the state and local government before moving into private practice. His company, Knox and Tanner, thrived for 25 years, transforming public places for clients such as the Universities of Sydney, New South Wales and ANU, local governments and public and private schools. If everyone who has joined, if you'd like to use the Q&A function, if you have any questions, and if we get time, we'll get to ask Paul these questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Paul, and we look forward to building our local tree knowledge with you tonight.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Leanne. Next slide, please, Stephanie. All of us would be familiar with the usual things that are said about the benefits of trees, their microclimate amelioration effect, their habitat values, their even their role in some circumstances as part of a fire defence, which is some emerging theory. But I also wanted to make a point in this talk that the trees are the repositories of stories. This slab taken from a Wallengarra white gum, which was felled near my house, tells stories about the insects that lived in it, and other parts of that tree tell the stories of the birds and other animals that lived in, on and around it. Next, please. This slab taken from this scar tree tells the story of cultures and how they use these resources and use trees. And it's not just a story of individual species. These trees, as they stand today, the outcome of millions of years of evolution. So they're a snapshot, if you like, in the evolution of all sorts of plants on the planet. Before we go on, and next slide, but 2, please. Go on to which one? Before we go on, and apologies to people who've heard this before, but we are going to be talking Latin on this walk. So let me just explain very briefly taxonomic nomenclature. All the living things on the planet roughly divided into plants and animals. There's a few exceptions. And then if we look at the plants, which we're interested in, botanists have divided them up into families according to sets of common characteristics. And then within each family, there's a further subdivision with a limited focus on the characteristics, and that's the genus, or genera in the plural. And then within each genus, we go down to the individual plants which can't reproduce beyond themselves, so that level of specificity, and that's the species. And next, if we look at one of the plants that I'm going to be talking about later, the spotted gums in Muston Park, the family here is Myrtaceae, which is the family of many plants, including eucalypts. The genus is Corymbia, used to be eucalyptus. They've changed it to Corymbia, and the species is maculata. And plants are known by the genus and species names typically. And the binomial here is Corymbia maculata. The common name is still useful, spotted gum, but scientists tend to like the sort of specific and can't think of the word, but the preciseness of the Latin. So moving on and to the next slide, we're going to go down to Havilah Street. Havilah Street is just down the road, just a street between running off Victoria Avenue and Havilah Street. The trees that are of interest there are the Wilga, Gedgera parvifolia. They're members of the Rutaceae family, which is the family that contains, amongst other things, citrus. And the Gedgera, the Wilga, is a remnant of when Australia was wetter and warmer. And a lot of these plants from arid areas, the Wilga comes from now is native to areas towards the east of the continent where the rainfall is less than 750 millimetres. But a lot of the plants in those more arid areas, interestingly, have ancestry with rainforest plants, and they'll often occur in the same family. Rutaceae being in the family Rutaceae is evidence of that. There's a number of Wilgas in Havilah Street. They're not all great specimens, but there are a few really beautiful specimens, lovely trees, and a very sort of weeping habit. They have these little tiny white flowers, which allegedly have a fetid smell. They smell okay to me, but they're attractive to blowflies, which is one of the pollinating insects. On the positive side of the scent aspects of Wilga, if you burn the leaves, they allegedly discourage mosquitoes. There's also been a useful fodder plant in those parts of Australia. Very attractive to sheep, apparently less attractive to cattle. Now we're going to move back up and around and come down in the next slide to Baldry Street. Next one, please. So very close to Havilah. I think it's the next street along. And next slide, this street, Baldry Street, is a bit famous, modestly famous in the native food aficionados, because it's lined with this plant, Podocarpus alatus, the brown pine or Warra plum in English. With some, I'm trying to show wherever I can the indigenous names of these two things. I think Gidney Wallen would be a good one to use here. These are beautiful dark evergreen trees from coastal New South Wales. They're actually a type of conifer, even though they don't look like a pine tree. And its fleshy cones are sweet and produced in great profusion. Next slide, please, which you can see in this slide coming up. All those little things that look like peas in the photo to the right are the seeds. Unfortunately, I didn't get there in time to photograph it when the trees were in fruit, but they produce millions of these fruit. And it's related to a cone that you would see on a more typical looking conifer. And these things are really sweet. They're like grapes, very, very edible, and they would have been a most important food source. So profuse indeed, lots of them. And I've been down there. I did go down there when they were in fruit recently, and there was a gentleman there collecting bucket loads of them, so he knew all about them. Next, please. The podocarps are an interesting group of plants, and they're found right across the southern hemisphere. You get them in South America and South Africa as well as Australia. But conifers have a history, including the podocarps, that go back 300 million years. Next, when the modern continents were all joined together in Gondwana, and the ancestors of the modern podocarps would have occurred throughout this supercontinent. And there's debate about whether things like the Podocarpus in Baldry Street have a common ancestor back to this time, or whether the distribution across the more modern continents was done by some other means. But there's another podocarp coming up in a couple of streets, which is interesting to think about how they might have come from the same Gondwanan ancestor. Next. While you're in Baldry Street, keep an eye out for this tree. It flowers around Christmas. It's Barclay syringifolia. The specimens here are fairly poor. Actually, they look like pretty bad trees, but the flowers are spectacular. a really good example of this tree is in the Pacific Highway entry to Abbottsley at Wahroonga. A beautiful tree, and always with these golden flowers at Christmas. But whilst these ones haven't been a runaway success, they're Queensland rainforest trees. They do reflect the imaginative and experimental approach that Willoughby Council horticulturists have taken to street tree planting. There are many really interesting trees in the streets of Willoughby, and they're still doing it. Next, we're going back to Victoria Avenue, next avenue. So next slide. So we're back up on Victoria Avenue, and yeah, here we go. The much maligned Platanus acerifolia, Platanus hybrida. There's a bit of debate about the correct name. It's a much maligned tree, mostly, I guess, because of the seeds, which affect asthmatophores rather badly. But imagine Victoria Avenue without them. Imagine, Paris and London without them as well, and Sydney for that matter. It's a ubiquitous city tree, and I guess it's mainly so common in urban areas because it has this fantastic resistance to pollution. It's deciduous, so it gets a new crop of leaves every year, but some of its bark is also deciduous. So some of the bark falls off and you get fresh lenticels, which give you the exchange of air. So they have a rethink about life every year. And also, of course, you can see in that picture down the bottom there that they tolerate the sort of civil engineering atrocities. They can take a lot of punishment. It's actually a hybrid, this tree. Species are meant to be things that don't hybridize, but there's quite a few hybrids in horticulture and botany, and this is a hybrid between the American sycamore, Platanus occidentalis, and the Oriental plane, Platanus orientalis. And it's thought that this hybridization occurred at the end of the 17th century. I'm not sure how they worked that out, but I have read that. Next one. Now we're going back to Muston Park. Muston Park, you could do a whole talk on Muston Park. Actually, there's some fantastic trees in there. I love, in particular, this circle of spotted gums, which creates quite a magical space within them because of their clean white trunks. These plantings, and you'll see them elsewhere in the LGA, Willoughby Park, for example, is another place where the man to which this is attributed, Rex Hazelwood, also did some work. He was a photographer and landscape designer of the early and middle 20th century. The common name spotted gum and the species name maculata refer to the spots on the bark. You can see them just in this picture. And if you sort of half close your eyes and put your hand in a certain position so you can't see the top of it, they're very, very similar to look at to a plane tree trunk. Next slide. This next one, please. Sorry, that was the close-up. Yeah, this I believe is Rex. He was appointed the official war photographer at the end of World War I. He was a very early uptaker of photography. And he was, as I say, appointed the official photographer at the end of World War I. Later in life, he worked with his brothers at their nursery in Epping, whereas presumably where he got the landscape design bug. Next slide. Next, we're going to Castle Cove Drive. Next one, which where you'll see an impressive planting of Casuarina cunninghamiana. These trees occur naturally along a watercourse and usually a little further inland. There's another one I'll show you in a minute, which is very similar but is more a coastal one. This one is more an inland tree, and it's thought by some people that Casuarina was a much more dominant tree. There's half a dozen species in Australia before people arrived here 50 or 60,000 years ago. The theory being that these people used fire a lot, and the eucalypts are well adapted to fire. They can reshoot and come back, as we know, whereas casuarinas are not so resilient to fire. I'm not sure whether that theory is well accepted, but it's one that I have heard. And I've also read that the First Nations people like these stands of casuarinas as campsites because you could place infants under these trees and be somewhat assured that they would be free from attack by little animals and snakes and things, because these things don't like crawling over the thick bed of needles that occurs underneath them. The other thing, of course, about underneath casuarinas is that nothing else much grows there, so you can sort of have a clear line of sight. Early European settlers, like the indigenous people, found the wood useful for many things. The Europeans especially cut down a lot of casuarinas to make shingles, roof shingles. Next one. The flowering of casuarinas, including Cunninghamiana, is terrific. The brown ones on the right are the male flowers, and the beautiful little red thing on the left is the female. And you can see the scale of the female ones. These ones, after fertilisation, develop into things about the size of a peanut, little cone-like seed pods. There's some casuarinas, some males in flower. The males, typically perhaps of males, are very showy, and you can always see them. They go really russet brown over the whole tree. The female ones are more discreet and a bit harder to find, but actually worth looking for. They're absolutely beautiful little things. Next slide. The casuarinas, to distinguish between species of casuarina, the thing is to count the leaf scales that you can see, the little pointy things creating a crown when you pull the segments of what is in fact a stem. When you pull them apart, you get these little scales appearing, and if you've got a magnifying glass, you can count them up, and that's usually the best way of telling the species. The one in the illustration is Casuarina glauca, which also grows in wet areas, but more around brackish estuaries and those sorts of settings. And it has, as you can see, 15 leaf scales. The Casuarina Cunninghamiana in Castle Cove Drive has 6 to 10. They probably, like a lot of these plants, they probably vary a fair bit, but I mean, that's one way into working out what the species is. Next slide. Yeah, whatever one might think about the invasion and colonisation of Australia, it's got to be said that some of the Englishmen involved were remarkably courageous and adventurous people. This is Alan Cunningham, after which Casuarina Cunninghamiana is named, and his name is on a lot of plants. He was the King's Collector at Kew in London before travelling by sail, of course, to Brazil and New Zealand. Then he circumnavigated Australia, and he made several inland trips of botanical exploration. He'd gone back to England, but in 1837 he sailed back to Australia to take up the position of government botanist, a position he quit quite soon when he was asked to grow vegetables for government officials. His younger Richard was also a botanist or a botanical enthusiast, superintendent of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney. But on yet another Cunningham exploration of botanical discovery, he was killed on the Bogan River in 1835. But there are a number of people, when you look into botanical names, who have these remarkably adventurous stories behind their naming of certain plants. Next, we are going to, next slide, please, to Man Street, which is a street that runs off High Street in Willoughby. Man Street has an impressive planting of these plants, Aphocarpus falcatus, and you can see by the family name up the top that these are podocarps, like the ones in Baldry Street, like the podocarpus in Baldry Street. So possibly, of common ancestry, yet to be sort of finally determined, I think, that theory. These are big, dark trees from the montane forests of southern Africa. Bark and seeds were used in traditional African medicine, and the tree was also used in construction and in tanning, which is interesting here. There's probably no actual connection, but there was a tannery just down the road, somewhere around where Bunnings is now, I think. Possibly not. They possibly weren't planted to fuel the tannery, but a neat little connection. Next slide. They're also terribly popular with cockatoos, like so many things. And if you go there at the right time, you'll see what you see in that photo, legions of cockatoos having an absolute party. And they rip the trees apart. You can see the debris in the gutter and on the ground there, all after the fruit, which they just love cracking and crunching. I know the trees seem to not suffer any permanent damage, and the cockatoos have a while of a time. Next, please. There we go, 620. We go back onto High Street, and High Street is interesting from a tree point of view because it's sort of a long linear arboretum of rainforest trees. East Coast rainforest trees seem to work well. A lot of them as urban trees, like you think of fig trees and some other trees we'll come to a bit further down through the talk, but they seem to work as urban trees, and this is evidenced in High Street, where you're now seeing some very successful plantings of waterhousia, which is one of the lily-pilly trees. You see that outside Harris Farm Market and elsewhere down the street. But this one you're looking at here is Aurantica rhombifolia. I've been looking at trees around Willoughby for the best part of 50 years, and that's how I came up with my selection. And this one's a little bit of a sentimental favourite because there were a lot of these Aurantica down High Street. A lot of them weren't great specimens, and I think council must have decided to replace them with something with a rather more regular form. But the orange berries on them were a feature of High Street. You still see there's still some there. In fact, they're in berry now. And it's also another one that was named by a friend, Alan Cunningham, I think, Aurantica rhombifolia. It's another rainforest native tree, East Coast rainforest native tree. From here, still on High Street. Next slide, please. I guess the most impactful trees on High Street are those massive fig trees in the playground of St Thomas's School. These mighty trees are native to Queensland and are impressive in lots of locations, including, among others, Hyde Park, where they were planted in the 30s, I believe, after and over the City Circle Railway was installed. And you can see from the lower slide how the trees, one tree dominates a huge area, which is both wonderful and problematic in some circumstances. Next slide. Such as this, the one on the left is Ficus hillii in San Francisco, where perhaps a little carelessly they've been planted as footpath trees in many, many locations, actually. And I know that the authorities there have some issues dealing with these trees, because when they're vigorous up on top, they're going to be vigorous underneath as well. And whilst fig trees have got a bad reputation, which I don't think is totally deserved, they are vigorous, and they can travel a really great distance. The picture on the right, it's a bit fuzzy, sorry, but it's a photograph taken by Frank Hurley, I think in 1948, of Hyde Park looking across to the cathedral. And if you look at the trees and the size of the canopies and compare them with what you see there now, you can see the tremendous growth that's happened in 80 or 90 years. And these fig trees now along the main concourse there are certainly intertwined above, forming a totally covered passageway. Next, please. The fig trees, all fig trees, have an amazing method of reproduction due to a thing called invaginated inflorescence, which simply means that the flower is actually surrounded by the fruit, and it's pollinated by tiny wasps in an incredibly complicated mating process that goes on, and in which the females die or lose their antennae and wings, and where the males, following mating, chew a hole in the fig wall through which any remaining live pollen-laden females can fly off to their next assignation. And I have heard of, and vegans, please excuse me, but I have heard that some vegan people don't like to eat figs because they contain animals. They're full of dead wasps and bits of wasp. An extraordinary way to go about it, but obviously very effective. Next one, we're going further up High Street towards the city and turning right into Laurel Street. Laurel Street, Willoughby, does not have laurel trees, but it has these beautiful Brazilians. Next slide. With the fantastic name of Libidibia faria. They used to be called something else, Caesalpinia. but it's a tree from Brazil. These trees, this photograph was taken a year ago, and I've had a more recent look, and they're thriving. They're a beautiful, beautiful dark canopy. They've got a lovely, next slide, lovely, white trunk, beautiful yellow flowers, another fuzzy photo, sorry. And just really attractive little single trunk tree. It seems to be a wonderful street tree. And they're also used a bit now because the favoured wood for guitar necks, I think it is a tree called rosewood, which is becoming rare. And Libidibia is suitable for the same purpose. Sorry, we seem to have slipped on a slide there. And they're used apparently in Stratocaster guitars, as favoured by the late Stevie Ray Vaughan. I tried to get an audio track, but I failed, sorry. Next, we're going just a bit down the road and a bit down Laurel Street to look at brushbox. Brushbox, of course, is perhaps the most common street tree in Sydney. It can be a tall, straight tree, really, really tall on the margins of a rainforest, or it can be a contorted, large shrub in the lee of a coastal dune, and everything in between. These trees have not escaped the inevitable hacking from overhead wires, but are still magnificent trees. It's a real survivor. Next slide, please. And it's uncommonly resistant to fungal infection. I've on a number of occasions cut into a branch to prune it for some reason, and even though it's been inexpertly cut, like just about every street tree brush box you can think of has been, the wood within a millimetre is completely sound, and it can tolerate tremendous sort of brutality around its roots too. So again, makes it a really handy thing to have that level of resilience to be used in streets. It does produce millions of seed capsules, which are sometimes a problem in streets because they're a bit like ball bearings. When I was a young landscape architect a long time ago, I worked for Ashfield Council, as it was then, and this was in when was it? It must have been the 80s, and there was a councillor who felt that Ashfield needed more native trees in its streets, and he asked me to do a survey, which I did. And it turns out that about 80% of the trees in Ashfield streets were natives. They were either brushbox or a couple of species of figs. So it's a tree, a wonderful tree. Maybe done a disfavour by its common usage, but that's what happens when you can put up with the sort of abuse of these trees take in streets. Next, we're going up to the currently rather empty shopping centre of Castlecrag on Edinburgh Road. I chose the trees there in the shops, and these trees are Eucalyptus scoparia, the Wollongara white gum. It's the same species of the slab I began the talk with. And I chose it because it sort of speaks to the transitional nature of our urban landscape. The Wollongara white gum has a tiny natural distribution, as you can see in the little map of New South Wales. There's little dark green dots up towards the Queensland border. It's actually considered endangered in its native habitat, but it was a tree that was really, really popular in Sydney in the 70s and 80s, I suppose. Probably it is still fairly popular, but became very common in the suburbs as an ornamental tree. Many were planted in the 70s. Some of them by me as a labourer, and it looks like their life expectancy, sort of healthy, reliable life, is probably about 60 or 70 years. But some of them are still battling on. You'll see them distorted and battered and hacked in the streets, but their resilience is remarkable. Next slide. And there are a number of them around Willoughby. These ones in Castlecrag, and this one photograph on the right is one taken in Cowles Road, Mossman, where they've been brutalised, but they keep going. You can see the sort of treatment this poor character's had to take. The one on the right is in Castle Cove Public School, and it doesn't get any love there, but it's just shining through as a beautiful example. It looks like the sort of typical Australian gum tree. So an interesting tree. We talk about fashions in architecture and so on, but of course there are similar fashions in planting. Next slide, please, takes us to Northbridge, a corner in Tunks Road. And the next one, please. The tree here is another untidy eucalypt, which I had to put in because I find them a fantastic tree. This is Eucalyptus bicostata. There's a bit of debate about whether it's got another name, but bicostata will do us. And Urabi is a commonly used name. In Canberra, they like to call them blue gums. And it's a rangy, untidy, wonderful big tree. It has huge sickle leaves. For some reason, I've chosen to photograph a dead one, but those leaves will be 30 or 40 centimetres long and exactly like a sickle in shape. And you can see the lovely sort of dusted effect on the flower buds, and the flower buds then turn into these terrific capsules that look like the most sort of beautiful button you might have on a cardigan or something. And apart from just liking it and putting it in for that reason, it's a next slide. It's an example of the tendency of eucalypts to travel around the world because of their toughness and their adaptation to difficult circumstances. They're quite common in Canberra, where they've been used in many places, and the photograph at the bottom left there is at the ANU. The photograph at the bottom right is an example of the tree's international reputation. That's actually the Presidio in San Francisco again, which is a big area down near the Golden Gate Bridge. Used to be a military encampment, and in the 19th century, the person in charge, I can't think of his name, decided to plant a lot of trees, and he chose the Urabi because he'd heard that it was a tough tree, because they grow all through Mediterranean Europe, Northern Africa. You'll see them all through Spain and Portugal. Highly recognisable as a tree generally, but always those nuts and the big sickle-shaped leaves, as well as the sickle-shaped leaves. I forgot to mention they also will always tend to be displaying some juvenile leaves, which are totally different to the adult leaves. They're sort of almost round and quite blue in colour. But the Presidio in San Francisco, they decided to plant bicostata there. So over 100 years ago now. And you can see a person in the distance there, which gives you some scale on these trees. They are huge, and they're problematic now. People are finding them a bit too huge, and they drop the most insane amounts of leaf litter. So there'll be huge areas of bark and branches and twigs. It's like Australia's revenge on the world, having exported these trees. But they're so impressive. It's definitely worth a look if you're in San Francisco. And the other two photos at the top are the same species, but in a sort of a stunted form, in Ferncourt Avenue, Chatswood. I possibly shouldn't disclose the place where this tree is, because I feel I might jinx it by mentioning it, because I've been admiring this tree for 35, 40 years. Doesn't change much in size, but it's a great little survivor. You can see the sort of character in the bark in the photo in the top left-hand corner, and a really wonderful tree. Someone, possibly the people who live next door to it, always seem to want to cut off the juvenile leaves. So if you're listening, could you maybe leave a few next time they appear? An incredible character. Next slide, we're going up further towards the edge of Willoughby to Naremburn to Darville Street. And this street is a relic of a street tree fashion, again, promoted in the early 20th century, largely, I think, by Joseph Maiden, a famous botanist and director of the Royal Botanic Garden in Sydney. And he, I imagine, liked the idea that with Sydney's subtropical climate, it could turn into some sort of wonderful, tropical place. And these trees are very similar to the tree which produces dates. That one is Phoenix dactylifera, the ones you see around Sydney, Phoenix canariensis. And these were planted very, very widely. Perhaps in the time of Maiden, a lot of councils didn't have much infrastructure or budget, and a lot of the plant ideas, and some of the plants themselves came from the Botanic Gardens. So you'll see these all over the place in Sydney. There's a Ashfield Park as a particular example where there are huge avenues of them, and they were all the way through Centennial Park as well. But they've been hit by a disease, a fusarium, a soil-borne pathogen, which kills them. You know, it's very hard to recover from it. And so when they're gone, they're gone. And in Centennial Park, they've been, I think, all taken out and replaced by other trees, other species. And we're sort of losing them through Sydney. I think the ones in Ashfield Park are still in reasonable shape. And no doubt people are working on ways of dealing with the fusarium. But yes, Maiden's vision for Sydney unfortunately sort of faded because of the fusarium 100 years on. Next slide. We're going over to the other side now to Artarmon Reserve. Artarmon Reserve houses the Blue Gum High Forest that once dominated Sydney on the richer shale-based soils and now considered a critically endangered community. The next slide, the dominant one there is Eucalyptus saligna. A lot of these trees would be regrowth because Eucalyptus saligna is a huge tree. You know, I don't know, 100 metres perhaps, really, really big trees. Unfortunately for them, very good timber. So that would have been one of the reasons for their broad scale clearance. It operates usually in partnership with another eucalypt called the blackbutt, the Eucalyptus pilearis. And they once formed a canopy over vast areas of Sydney. Very, very hard to imagine how dark and gloomy and shaded it all must have been. Indeed, there are stories from the early days of the colony where men were sent on journeys of exploration of several days, you know, maybe even a bit longer, and coming back pale and exhausted after traipsing through this damp, dark, wet environment. Yeah, as I say, sort of hard to imagine this. So hard to imagine what it was like, and hard to imagine the industry that went into removing it over a relatively short period of time. Next slide. This is the Eucalyptus pilearis, the blackbutt, another fantastic tree. That the blue gum, and the one before, Eucalyptus salignus, can be distinguished because it's smooth up top, but the rough bark is only sort of a little fringe around the bottom. You know, rarely more than a couple of metres high. Whereas blackbutt, it's also smooth up top and it's growing in the same circumstances, but and also a tall, huge tree. But the rough bark goes up pretty much to the first branchings, as you can see here. Next slide. And so these trees, this forest indeed would have occurred over, you know, upper North Shore, northwest, some of the outer west, Parramatta, lower North Shore, mostly to the north of the harbour and the Parramatta River, because the richer soils were the shale soils which occurred on the Cap, which is pretty much where the Pacific Highway goes now. But they went well into what we now call the western suburbs as well. So anywhere where there was a decent shale soil. Next slide, please. We're going to Chatswood Park. Chatswood Park has an extraordinary number of Araucaria trees. This one now is the Araucaria bidwillii. For some reason, I'm sorry I haven't got a name, but that's the bunya, B-U-N-Y-A, native to Queensland. It's closely related to a tree that is a sort of fable tree, the monkey puzzle tree of Chile, because like the monkey puzzle tree, it has very sharp leaves. Whilst the branches are really neatly arranged like a ladder, you'd have to be mad to try and climb them. These trees, Araucarias generally, including the bunya and other ones, this is Araucaria bidwillii. I'm sorry I haven't written that up, I didn't notice, but Araucaria bidwillii. The hoop pine is Araucaria Cunninghamii, and the Norfolk Island pine is Araucaria heterophylla. And they're all very common trees, very commonly planted in the 19th century, and people, I think particularly in the 19th century, like the bunya, the Artarmon bidwillii, because of this extraordinary form it has. And if you had a homestead, a farm somewhere around the place, you'd plant these things as landmarks to your property. And interesting, the properties have gone, but in many cases the trees are still there. The next slide, please. The leaves are razor sharp. And it beggars belief how people were able to climb these trees, which they did, because this was the bunya was a great food source for the First Nations people. They don't produce fruit all at once or even regularly. Let's go to the next slide, please. But what they do produce, when they do produce them, are these massive cones, and they're as heavy as they look when they're green, and they tend to be held close into the trunk of the tree, so that a lot of park managers are worried about these trees because they've ended up in parks because the homesteads have gone, because there's a danger here. If one of these falls, it would certainly kill you, but I'm not sure how many people have been killed. I guess you'd have to be very unlucky, but what would happen with the First Nations use of this tree is that people would climb up the trees, believe it or not, and chop the cones down as they were ripening, and then they'd hit on the ground, fall on the ground, and shatter a little bit, and you get a big brown seed out of all those little scales you can see on the cones that the man's holding, about the size of a chestnut. And if you roast it up, they're very tasty and very nutritious, very sort of a great source of nutrition and carbs. And when the trees were in fruit in the Bunya Mountains and other parts of Queensland, the local people would travel for miles and miles, and there'd be a huge sort of celebration festival around the fruiting of the bunyas. There's one story of a pastoralist observing all the people moving off because the bunyas were in fruit, and a lot of them looked a bit the worse for wear, a bit tired, a bit undernourished perhaps, lacking in energy. And then he saw the same people coming back a week or two later, and they'd put on considerable weight and they looked a lot happier. Very delicious, very nutritious fruit. And you can sometimes buy them around, select fruiterers, but when they're in fruit, a good place to go actually is Rookwood Cemetery, where there's thousands of them, and you could really get a feast going out at Rookwood. I think of these trees, next slide, a bit hard to see perhaps on this picture, but I think of bunyas and other members of the Araucaria genus as being landmarked horizon trees, and you can sort of see it in this picture taken from the top of Chatswood Chase. They emerge above just about everything in our city, and you can pick them out as you travel along various roads. Very distinctive landmarks. Next, we're going. Next slide, please. We're going to perhaps one of the favourite trees of Willoughby, the Angophora at the Chatswood Police Station. It's also, for me, a favourite species of tree, the Angophora costata. And it's perhaps the most distinctive tree of Sydney, or Sydney Harbour anyway. Even though they grow further out west, the side of the Angophoras hanging over the Hawkesbury sandstone on the harbour and so on is totally distinctive. And this one in the police station is a wonderful example, and the whole building has been designed around it. They need to do something about the parking policy, but they've preserved a soft area under just about the entire canopy of this tree, and it would be difficult to think of a more sculptural tree. Next slide, please. With its curling branches and its extraordinary ability to grow bark over wounds, producing these wonderful lumps and bumps that you see in this close-up of the one at the police station. I have read that the local people used to score around these lumps. You can see the one on the sort of perhaps the left-hand side. Trunk's a good example. They'd score around that with some sharp implement, and then simply wait for the next lot of bark, because the bark on an Angophora is deciduous. It falls off each year. and then they'd be able to take the previous year's bark off, and it would form a perfect little bowl or coolamon. Very patient people, very resourceful people. That's where my story's finishing, with the one at Chatswood Station. And I just wanted to bring back this idea that trees are standing there as sort of silent sentinels, observing too far, I suppose, but they're there when lives are being lived in, on and around them. You know, there would be trees around Sydney which witnessed, for example, the first encounter of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. Perhaps not the first one, but you know what I mean, one of those early contacts. And there's lots of discussion around at the moment, TED Talks and the like, about the possibility that trees might even be sentient. And there's plenty of evidence that trees can communicate through fungal connections and other means, but maybe it's a bit of a stretch to attribute sentience to organisms that don't have a central nervous system. But this idea that trees as witnesses, as story keepers, by virtue of their long lives and their long history on Earth, I think is quite demonstrable, and I hope I've made a claim for that here tonight. Maybe if we lack the brains and foresight to not recognise that we should stop cutting down trees for environmental reasons, perhaps the thought that in destroying trees, we're losing connections to our short and very long history, maybe that might add weight to the argument. When I began to study horticulture in the 70s, I began to learn the names of plants. This naming of things is something we don't perhaps give enough significance to. The experience for me was like the world suddenly becoming three-dimensional, where I had been walking through a place populated by strangers, and now I could pick out friends in the crowd. So my hope here is that maybe I've done something similar for you by telling you things that you may not have known about your own suburban environment and the trees in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Wow. I have to say that all the scientific tree names really roll off your tongue so easily. I wish they did with me. So I'll have to practice.
Another 40 years, you'll be right.
Yes. We do have a couple of questions just before we go to the questions from everybody who's attended the webinar. I wanted to know your thoughts, Paul, about, you know, the street trees that we have and the plantings where we plant the same one species, you know what I mean, straight down in a line. What's your thoughts on that? Do you know what I mean? Just and what you've observed for diversity, etc.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, monoculture is usually not a good thing. And you know, when you think of, say, Havilah Street with the wilga trees, some of them are great and some of them are almost dead. You know, so if you were in anything like that, if you're attempting a totally irregular thing, you're really up against it. Your chances are there'll be some missing teeth in the smile. So that would be one reason for mixing up the trees. One of my heroes, inspirations, was an early landscape architect called Alan Corrie, who wrote a pamphlet on this called Trees in Streets Rethought, and he had a whole other approach in which he suggested the planting of trees with mixed species and not in a straight line, you know, sort of groups. And you could do this if you, maybe an opportunistic approach would be to plant a tree where you've got a really good opportunity to do it, but don't try and plant them where there isn't an opportunity. If there's like the big fig trees of High Street hanging over the road, well, you don't need a street tree there. But you need it in other parts. So maybe rather than just saying every 10 metres I'm going to plant a tree, then there would be better approaches. And you might benefit from species diversity. There's a street in is it Neutral Bay, Clark Street, where the Japanese brides often get photographed under the jacarandas. Is that Clark Street? There's a street off that which I think Alan might have influenced, and it's got spotted gums in it in a very sort of random naturalistic setting. And it's one of the rare examples of what I think was a really great idea, but you know, you don't see much of it.
No, it's a really good point. I'll go to some of the questions that we have. I've got a few of my own, but I'm going to get to the audience questions first. From Judy, we have, what are the trees in McKellen's Road near High Street, north side, which have lots of blue-black fruit that fall on the ground and nothing seems to eat them? Do you know that one on McKellen Street near High Street?
Street.
McKellen. Near the High Street shops.
Yeah. Yes. Blueberries that nothing eats.
Blue-black fruit that's dropping down.
I'm struggling to place them, but blue-black fruit sounds like Elaeocarpus, a blueberry ash, which has been used a fair bit, and there are some cultivars of that which are quite commonly planted as street trees, and certainly their fruit is blue-black. But I just can't picture them, McConnell Street. Sorry,
that's okay.
I must have seen them a million times.
Yes, I know. I'm in my head also thinking. Yes.
I'll go and have a look tomorrow and post it somewhere.
We might be able to get it out onto our email. That is a follow-up after this.
Yeah, okay.
When you've been able to have a look. If you have a look at it in the morning and then let me know and I'll put it in the email. That's the follow-up email.
I'll do it.
Hopefully that helps, definitely. Judy. Kathy asks, are the male and female Casuarina flowers found on the same or separate trees?
Yeah, well, separate trees. They're what's called dioecious, which means you need two individuals to produce a new individual. Although, interestingly, I have seen both on one tree. So I think maybe that's a bit of a human construct to make these rules about things. And but I think generally speaking, you need two trees. Yeah, there's a street, and I'm not going to be able to think of the name of this either, in that runs off. Sorry, my brain's gone dead. I'll tell you this one too. But there's a street with the planting of Casuarina glauca, which is the one that grows in brackish water, and Melaleuca, that runs down towards the incinerator.
Marlborough Road.
Marlborough, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're great examples of Casuarina glauca. And I know there's one place, because I took that out of my talk to get in some other suburb ones, but there's one place there where there's a male and a female on opposite sides of the street. It's like a love story of Casuarinas. Yeah, but you need two, almost always.
Yes, separate trees. Oh, Ruth has this question, an opinion. With new government planning affecting land within 400 or 800 metres of the centre of Chatswood, are there any significant tree species in that area that will be affected that you know of, Paul? It's a pretty big circumference, I think, that 400 to 800 metres, and I suppose it depends on the areas that people might be considering new development.
I suppose ones like the police station, Angophora, and the Araucarias in Chatswood Park, and there's a great group of Araucarias on that place that used to be a Grand Victorian home and was a nursing home more recently on Mowbray Road. Another little botanical garden of Araucarias there. So they would be within that scope, I suppose. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the trees that I've talked about tonight, they're not going to qualify as sort of significant trees, but there would still be a terrible loss if you lost them, because they're so interesting, and it's like the wilga, and the podocarpus. They're such interesting trees, and they're such great evidence of what people have done and how the suburbs developed. We need some category like that rather than just saying grand old tree. Like, you can't treat everything like that and go for the police station, and developers aren't going to have the same motivation that the state government had about a tree. So, I guess we'll just have to.
All trees are precious.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's the best. Exactly.
Okay, thank you. Margaret asks, do some of the Angophora in Castlecrag have a problem dropping or thinning of the leaf canopy? Do you know?
I'm not familiar with a particular problem there, but it happens. They're quite sensitive angophorous. So if you're, if you change the groundwater setup, or maybe, change the way the wind moves around them and so forth, it's hard to pinpoint, but yeah, they're quite sensitive, and a loss of canopy could easily happen. A lot of eucalypts, I mean, it's not, Angophorus not a eucalypt, but it's similar to it. A lot of them do drop leaves, but seem able to recover. I think that's been the thing with the Wollongara whitegum too. Sometimes you see them and you think, oh my God, they've had it, but they come back. So I don't know of a particular problem in Castlecrag. If you looked around, you'd probably see some clearance going on and some new construction and a 6-car basement garage going in next to it. And these things would certainly affect them. But on the other hand, these things pretty significantly unpredictable. They may be okay.
Yes. Well, I think that we've got, there's one more question, I think. Sorry, and then I will wrap up. Deborah asks, is there a policy regarding planting native trees with edible fruits as another way to appreciate their qualities? So is there a policy?
Yeah, and for street trees, I don't think there is one in Willoughby. Certainly a lot of people would have that view, and a lot of the trees that go in probably do support that idea. If they are blueberry ash in McClellan Street, that would be a fruit that's attractive to animals and so on. And I'd like to see more of the Podocarpus alatus planted, because they're so great and they're such wonderful trees. And they're, the Afrocarpus in Man Street, I sympathise a bit with the residents there, because those are big dark trees, but whereas the Podocarpus gets that fabulous fruit which would be attractive to animals and humans, and it's a slightly more comfortable sized tree, you might say. So I'm not aware of a policy. I think it would be a good criterion to apply to choosing street trees, but I'm not aware of a policy.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Okay, so we've had a wonderful talk listening to your knowledge. I just wanted to thank you for taking us on a journey of trees, and also wanted to share with everyone, since we are talking about trees, that this is part of the Canopy of Life Tree Festival, this webinar, and our festival is celebrating trees within our local urban surroundings. And we have 2 more weeks of this festival to run. And next week, we have a few spots still available in these 2 workshops that people might be interested in. So if you have your phone close by, please try and get out the QR code. You might want to come along to a native tree ID workshop, or we're actually going around Beauchamp Park and having a look at the Chatswood Urban Tree Stroll, with Margot. So they will be both wonderful workshops, and if you have time, come along to those ones and sign up. And one other thing I wanted to highlight to everyone is that tomorrow, Paul is going to come along to be one of our presenters and speakers at our tree symposium that starts at 12 p.m. at Chatswood Library. If you would like further details on that, please have a look at our website. There will be an email sent out later on this with a recording of this webinar and with a survey link, which we ask if everybody could please fill in. We value the feedback that we receive from the community. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you. Huge thanks to you, Paul, for sharing your knowledge and your insight into your vast experience and knowledge into trees. And so we wish everyone well, and thanks and good night.